Okay, see if I can get this cover in place. To hook this tip under a ledge here, a little notch, this hole has to fit over that pin, this hole has to fit over that pin, this spring has to be on the right side of that pin. It's only a minor nuisance. Of course, stuff doesn't want to line up very well. That's it seated. Of course, you've got to do that without disturbing your two brass standoffs, which are just sitting there waiting to fall over and cause you grief. Or worse still, they'll shift sideways into some space, so that when you do the screws up and you're not aware of that, they will then come out at a later date and block the action of something. Let's get these two screws, and this one's a shoulder screw that goes through the MX sink lever. And I've got to hook that spring into position behind that stud on the lever, like that. Okay, so that's all sitting there quite nicely at the moment, quite happily. The B lever goes on here over that stud. That's held down with a screw with a spring on it. The spring acts on the B lever and also on another lever here. So I've got to get this screw started. Hopefully not displace the spring at the same time. I think I just did displace the spring. The spring runs round a groove in the head of the screw, and it should be in that groove, not trapped underneath it. Okay, so it's sitting there at the moment. I've got to get this hook at that end of the spring around that side of that arm. Let's see if I can do it. Right, tuck that down in place. Okay, that spring's doing its best to get off the head of that screw, and it's acting against the inside of this lever, which is exactly what we need it to be doing. So that is sitting correctly positioned. Yeah, it is now. And is that screw down tight, and is that spring correctly positioned? It looks good. Okay. At that point, we need the main lever the shutter release and the speed settings cam plate. I'll put the shutter release in place. It's awkward getting its little spring down inside the housing there, because it's a really odd shape. It's it was obviously a bit of an afterthought. Just checking that the flash sync mechanism cocks and releases nicely, and it does, so that's good. The main lever here needs to be, well, we need to put a bit of lubrication in a couple of spots. Let's do the main lever. So I normally do the inside edge, the outside edge, taking particular note of the catches and where it operates the mate the retard gear train, and at the tip and at the tail of this bird ball, it doesn't hurt to have some on the inside edge of that spring where it rubs against the case. So let's bring this back in. There's a couple of spots here I need to do. Here and here, the arm that lifts the pallets, and here, this is the arm that swings the whole mechanism across. That'll do. Let's ensure that this is in the cocked position. It was not. Makes it, otherwise it's very hard to get the spring down inside here. So we get the spring down in here, lift that B lever out of the way. Ooh. Like that. Hold back the pallets, swing that arm back out the way. You should allow that to drop down, that to drop down, that to drop down. Get the B lever out from underneath there, please. Thank you. Get the spring hooked over its post. And get the spring on this catch. Okay, that's in the cocked position. That's all ready to fire. Is the B lever, the spring here correctly positioned? Yes. That's the 500th of a second speed spring. You can be sure that's very clever at getting into the wrong orientation. Then you either end up with a high speed that doesn't work or a shutter that won't cock. Right, so I'm running some molybdenum paste around the speed settings cam plate, and where it picks up that high speed spring and compresses it is right here. That's where that spring compresses, so I'll run some down there, but I don't like to put too much on there. It's always putting lubricants where it's not needed is not a helpful thing typically. It just causes stuff to gum up. Okay, so that's set in the B position. Let's see if it works. That worked. This will be about 1 second. This would be something like a tenth. And if we come right round to here, you see that as I come right round to here, that spring is pushed around and under tension. Now if we cock the shutter, now we should get a 500th of a second. That was very quick. So that appears to work nicely. That'll give us a 250th. That all appears to work quite nicely. I'm going to put the front plate on, which I'll clean first, and then test my shutter speeds. The key, if you're going to have problems, you'll notice it between the 25th and the 10th of a second positions. If they both appear to be the same, or if the 25th appears to be slower than the 10th, then you're going to have problems. You're going to have to adjust the position of that retard gear train to get everything correct. And it can be very tedious, as I've said on many other occasions. But generally you find that if the shutter was in good working condition, but the shutter needed to be serviced, then the shutter will be in good working condition once the shutter has been serviced. You don't normally need to muck with the adjustments. I'll find the right screwdriver for that, and I'll go and test this shutter. Well, those speeds appear slightly slow to me, which means that I will have to make some adjustment. Take that cover off and have a look at this retard gear train. I'll remove the main lever so I can see what I'm doing easier. Okay, so it seemed to run a little bit slow, and it seemed to run fairly uniformly slow. Probably about a quarter of a stop to half a stop at the faster speeds. I suspect we've got too much engagement at this end. This is where the main lever engages the mechanism at this point, and if I swing this outwards at this end, that would reduce the engagement and speed the shutter up. Because it's fairly uniform, I think the 1 second speed was quite close. It was slightly slow, but not much. I think this end is where I'm going to make my adjustments. Now, my relationship between the 25th and the 10th are quite good at the moment, so I don't want to have to move this an awful long way. I do know someone's bent the pin on the arm here. They've bent it inwards, which would speed the shutter up. It may mean that they've compensated by doing that for something that they should have done a different way by changing the position of the retard gear train. Anyway, I'm fairly committed to this. Let's slacken that screw off and move that speed train out very slightly, if it will move. If it doesn't really want to move, that suggests that it's all as far across as it's going to go. Let's try slackening the screw at this end. This is awkward because it's a post. You've got to have another screwdriver shaped like this to get to that. Let's see if that speed train will move out slightly. Oh, it certainly would. Okay. Right. I will put this back together again and test the speeds and see what I've got. Hopefully there won't be too much toing and froing. Not uncommonly, you can spend 45 minutes doing this without any trouble at all. Well, the shutter speeds are good, so I'm quite pleased with that. So I can clean up the outer case and get that back in place. Of course, I've got to connect up my flash sync wire at the same time. So here's the case all cleaned and ready to go, and here's my shutter. Now I need to get my flash sync wire connected first of all. So I hold the wire out like this, put it in position at the back of the shutter like that. We have our tiny plastic insulator. Get that down the hole, and then the screw. Which I'm just doing my best to lose. See if I can get that screw started. I've got a magnetised screwdriver here. That's not always an asset. Let's try another screwdriver. even though it's a tiny screw, I can get it started with a larger screwdriver. Then run that down with a small screwdriver now that's in place. Okay, so that's in place. Just give the curved rack a wipe with molybdenum paste, inside edge and top and bottom. Cock the shutter and try not to release it again instantly. Put the curved rack in place. I should be able to get the case down over the top. No, it's just fallen behind something. Let's get that out again. Cock the shutter, get that curved rack, that's better. Now, that's all in place. We've got 2 screws to go in here. It's not hard to tell where they go. The one with the flange goes here. And the very short countersunk head screw goes over here. Our click stops for the aperture settings. You can see that the distances are not even along here, and neither are the distances along here, so it's not hard to tell that the end that's got the clicks furthest apart goes at the large aperture end, and small apertures are much more close together. So that's all good. That's as it should be. Right, the lenses. Let's have a look at these. Okay, so I usually just work to a bit of a pattern with the lenses. First of all, I want to get any oil or grease off the outside of the body of the lens, trying not to get this anywhere near the glass. So I'm just using a bit of naphtha to clean the body of the lens, and you can see probably by the colour of that how much filth there was on there. Same with the rear group. Keeping this off the glass, because if you transfer any grease onto that glass, you spend ages trying to get it off again afterwards. Right, so that should suffice for that. Now I'll use some glass cleaner on a cotton bud, and I'll start with the front group. I'm rotating this cotton bud as I go. And then with the dry end I'll wipe that wet surface smear free. At least that's the aim. It's very hard to judge how clean you've got something like that because it's deeply concave. I'm going to wipe this round that surface there around the edge while I've got it, because I've done with that cotton bud. I just don't want to be smearing anything anywhere. And I'll do the front surface now in exactly the same way. It's easier to see the front surface because it's convex. In convex surfaces you can angle the lens to the light and you can judge by the reflections how clean you've got them. Concave surfaces are much more difficult to deal with. But if you get the outside surface clean, you can look through the lens and judge how well you've done with the rear surface. Okay, that looks pretty good. And I'll look through that, see what it looks like. Yeah, a little bit of a smear on that rear surface still. Let's go back and have another go at that. Now with the Retina IIa, with the xenon lenses, it's quite common to have an uncleanable haze on the innermost surfaces, the surfaces facing the shutter blades. And it's something to do with the nature of the glass itself. Rodenstock haligons made at the same time and fitted to the same cameras don't suffer from it. The Xenar lenses fitted to the Retina IIa of the same period, made by Schneider, they don't suffer from it either. So it's something to do with the choice of optical glass for the xenons for those particular cameras. But if the glass deteriorates, it just goes, it gets a haze on it. And the haze is the surface. It's not on the surface, it is the surface. It will not clean off. It's not always the case, but it's often the case. Sometimes the haze is just the normal haze. It's just a haze of oil droplets, and it cleans away readily. But fairly commonly, as I say, you can get a haze on these innermost surfaces and it will not clean away. Very likely the lenses could be repolished by a specialist who deals in repolishing and recoating lenses, but the cost of that sort of treatment is very high. It's something people might choose to do for their rare lens, for their Leica or something, but it's not something that you would normally be doing for something like this. This lens looks pretty good to me. In fact, it looks very good. Right, let me put that rear group in place. And then it's often easier to judge the state of these looking into it rather than through it. Looking into it against the dark shutter blades, you can often judge how clean you've got things. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm quite pleased with that. These lenses should only be finger tight. They don't need to be more than finger tight. So that shutter is ready to go on the camera body. I've got one paper shim and one metal shim. So I put the paper shim on first so that it's protected from damage when I fit the shutter to the camera body. And now I'll have a go at that. So we've got to get the shutter release arm into the body at this point. We've got to get our coupling here, the curved rack coupled to here, in the correct position. You can't tell what the correct position is until you test it. So as I wind this, I want to see what happens. It's not reaching the end of the stroke. It tells me that I'm too far advanced with it. So if I wind the focus out to the closest distance, lift the shutter slightly, I can move that rack back one tooth. And see if the action will complete. It completed. The shutter cocks and fires. Will it cock and fire on a 500th of a second? That's where the most tension goes on here. Let's find out. It does. So I've got that correctly positioned. I can hold that with one hand, take the retaining ring and fit it in at the back of the camera. And if I find my spanner, I can run that down. That just shifted on me. Okay, so that's all cocking and firing nicely. I'll tighten that up and I'll check my focus. Because although the rangefinder is set correctly to the focus scale ring, I haven't checked the focus of the lens at the film plane. It'll probably be good because we've disturbed nothing. Everything went back to where it came from, but I've got to test it. So I'll do that. So I'll set the shutter to B, set the aperture to f2 and put a screen on the back and check that and see what I get. I'll report back. Well, the focus is good. Final check over, I've decided there's some internal haze in this front group and it'll be on the back of the front element in this group. So I'm just going to back off those two lock screws, remove that, and I'll check to make sure. I'm pretty confident it's on that surface. It could be on this surface, but I'll clean those and put it back together. Okay, I'm happy with the state of that. So here we have it. Nice Retina IIa camera ready to go home. I'll put a bit of polish on that back, see if I can improve those dull spots where the Zeiss bumps used to be, and of course they'd been high, so they'd had the surface rubbed off them. So they're not as shiny as the rest of the leather because they were open to damage. So I'll just put a bit of polish on there, but that should sort that out. But of course you can see nice painted edges, nice tidy camera. This is a nice example. It had a few wee problems when it came in, but now it's great. Thanks for watching.